From the heartland of America, it's the Bail in the Midwest podcast. Hosted by Shane Rolf. Executive producer, David Stuckman.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pre-trial release in the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 40 years. This is last May, or just a couple months ago, was my 40th year in this. So I've been doing this for way too long. Like I said, 40 years is a long time to do the same job or work for the same company or even work in the same field. But there was a time in American history where that was the goal. Cradle to grave type companies, Ford and General Motors, U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. You worked at these jobs, you provided for your family, you bought a home, and you built a life working for these places. One could argue that this was the American dream. And there were a whole host of small businesses along with these larger businesses, small-scale entrepreneurs who built and created American towns. The town squares of classic Americana, small towns were filled with small, locally owned businesses. When I was a kid, the drugstore in our town was owned and operated by the pharmacist himself. When I was a teenager, Mr. White himself owned the White's Auto Parts store and was behind the counter where I bought all the starters and alternators that I always seem to have to replace. And when I first started in bail bonds, my partner owned a martial arts bookstore. There aren't a lot of small retail stores anymore. There's some. Walmart moved into smaller and smaller towns and devastating the businesses on the old town square. Amazon initially ran roughshod over the small bookstores, even those that specialized in martial arts, and then ran roughshod over everybody else. And you can argue that this is just the natural progression of a market-based economy. Consolidation, efficiency, economies of scale. Build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. There's no question that Amazon is hard to beat. I click on a button on my computer and in 24 hours, the item I want is on my front porch. I don't have to go anywhere. And while one could reasonably expect that some larger company, more professionally managed, could move in and possibly put you out of business, possibly make your life more difficult, what you don't expect is that the government will set up shop as your competitor or go to the local legislature and simply, with a stroke of the legislative pen, outlaw your entire industry. That is the competition that the bail profession faces, the ultimate rug pull from the government. You build a company, you build a life, and it's just gone. There are thousands of small bail bond businesses that have simply had their livelihoods stolen in the name of reform. Now, I have to admit, as I've gotten older, this has become a bigger fear. How do you start over after you spent 4 decades building a business? In other areas of the country, these were multi-generational family-owned businesses that were simply legislated out of existence. And when I think about it, I don't want to engage in self-pity because I don't recommend that, and that's never healthy, but it's easy to fall into. I'm often reminded of Michael Douglas's character in Falling Down, when the quote says, "I'm the bad guy." How did that happen? I did everything they told me to do. From a bail bonds perspective, I was there every day. I worked 18-hour days, 24-hour days. I answered the phone all the time. I got my people to court. I got the people who didn't go to court back in. I did what I was supposed to do. How is it that I'm somehow evil? Now, there's a lot of that going on in America. Middle-aged men, especially those without college degrees, have been suffering increasingly high mortality rates, described as deaths of despair, often brought on by substance abuse following a rug pull by life. My guest today is a victim of government bail reform, or as another guest called it, bail elimination. Chris Blaylock was a multi-generational bail bondsman in New Jersey when Chris Christie and the Democratic legislature decided spending $250 million a year was a small price to pay to eliminate hundreds of family-run bail bond agencies in New Jersey. But Chris didn't fall down and instead rebuilt himself into one of the preeminent individuals in bail today. Chris, I apologize for the long monologue, but welcome to the podcast.
Appreciate it, Shane. That was the falling down analogy is spot on. So let's get into it. That's it.
Well, let's talk about your background. I mean, you kind of touched over multi-generation, but how did you come to be involved in bail?
So, you talk about reinventing yourself. I mean, I think I've had to do that a couple of times now. It's never necessarily a fun thing, but it can be rewarding. I think ultimately that path was set out for me. I just didn't really know it, but I grew up in Northern Virginia. My didn't know my real dad. My stepfather and my mom. My stepfather, let me back up. My stepfather was working with his brother, Northern Virginia bail agents, right outside of DC on the Beltway. At some point, my mom and him decided that it was a good idea to go out on his own, so he did, or they did, and built a fairly decent sized retail operation. I remember, really digging through the cobwebs. I mean, I remember going to the jail as a teen. I remember, skips. You probably can't get away with that now, but those that had skipped bond and going out on 4th of July and leaving your dinner at the table to go take care of somebody that had skipped bond, that sort of thing. So a lot of memories there. I went to college after that. Didn't, admittingly, I don't think my parents wanted me to get into the profession, even though I kind of felt like that was always my path. I think things had started capitulating a little bit with the industry. It wasn't necessarily as the same in the same lens as what it was in the 80s at the time. So they started to see some issues arising. Came back to Northern Virginia, ended up moving out to Philadelphia area. Our retail business was still going strong in Virginia, and then unfortunately my stepfather passed away unexpectedly in his mid-50s. There were no other children; it was just me. So, long story short, I helped my mom unwind our retail operation in Northern Virginia, and brought us up to New Jersey, where I was at the time. Spent a decade in New Jersey, building a retail operation in the southern part of New Jersey, servicing about 5 jails or so. And then obviously bail reform kicked in and, sort of kicked us in the teeth, and arguably citizens of New Jersey, if depending on who you ask. And beyond that, it started to develop into advocacy realm. And, I don't know if you want to get into that at this stage, but, certainly New Jersey, when they passed the law in 2014, it ramped up and went into effect in 2017, pretty much took everybody out. And so there I was, left holding the bag, so to speak.
All right. And so in 2000, so New Jersey passed the law, and we'll get more into New Jersey, but so basically they passed the law in 2014. Chris Christie was the governor at the time. Legislative was primarily Democratic legislature.
Yep.
And then it took them 3 years to actually implement this.
Yeah, so I mean, it was really kind of new territory, I think, for the profession in general. Not many people were talking about risk tools at the time. We really didn't know anything about it. If anything, it was being posited as sort of the next generation of pretrial greatness, was the fact that algorithms could predict whether or not somebody was going to fail to appear, how dangerous they were, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and maybe this is a little conjecturing, but, Chris Christie at the time had presidential aspirations.
Oh, yeah.
He wanted to cross the aisle. So one of his hot buttons, for whatever reason, he called a special session in 2014, brought all the legislature back to pass bail reform. And essentially the package was this: create preventive detention, because New Jersey was a right to bail state. So we're going to put a constitutional amendment out for the voters to create preventive detention, and then essentially replace that decision making with pretrial risk tools. And this was uncharted territory. So I don't know that we had a lot of, the industry or the profession had a lot of experience with dealing with that sort of framework on reimagining pretrial. So there was a little disorganization there. I think there was a bit of a breakdown, with the association at large, the sort of the three-legged stool, be it the agents, the surety companies, and any kind of advocacy group, American Bail Coalition, et cetera, PBOS, that sort of thing. And so in 2014, Chris Christie called a special session. They passed it. There was really still a lot of uncertainty as to what that meant. It took several years to roll out and define what that is, and the courts were left to define what it actually meant. Senate Bill 926 and what the constitutional amendment. Of course, they had to pass preventive detention. So between August and November, because it was placed right on the ballot, I think it's really where the breakdown happened. At least, for those listeners wondering, kind of where what happened between it passing and what did we do leading up to the constitutional amendment. And there's a big lesson there. And the lesson is we said nothing. And the League of Women Voters and the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center and all these different organizations were pounding the drum that this was the new reimagined sort of pretrial framework. And even though we had our own analysis as to what that meant, we just didn't organize enough to get the voice out or to get the message out to voters. And surprisingly, I mean, this goes back several years, but I have to think I think we only lost by, 7 points or something like that on the constitutional amendment, something in that range. And really, that was the catalyst to start an entire new movement, really, for the next decade. And when it passed in 2014, kind of led up to that, from a practical standpoint, January 1, 2017, it was just like this light switch went off, and that was it. There was, mom and dad weren't calling for their loved ones or brothers, sisters, sons, that sort of thing. Everything was being run through the risk tool. And we went from a right to bail state to locking up, 8,000 to 9,000 people a year, preventively detained.
And that kind of gets me back to you. I mean, I just can't imagine. I mean, what we see is, so things kind of go up, but I can't imagine everything just stopped. I mean, and you at that point in time, you're like 45 years old, you got a family, you got kids, and basically just all goes away. I mean, I know we can talk about the details. I don't know how much you want to get into the person, but how did that impact you? I mean, just obviously financially, but I mean, emotionally as well. I mean, we can do the view thing and talk about our emotions.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and I've talked about it, in certain settings, and I think you can imagine it was what you think it would be, right? I was in a position where now I had, tens of millions of dollars worth of liability. We just didn't forget about the folks that, were out on bond. So we were still servicing us. So essentially what the state did was force us to continue doing our job, while at the same time eliminating the way that we earn a living. So there was nothing new coming in. Everybody was getting released or detained. But I had hundreds of folks out on bond. They just didn't forgive that. So we were continuing. So I still had to staff my office. I still had to do fugitive recovery, that sort of thing. And so, that was hard. On a personal level, it was difficult, as I think any husband, father, son, my mom has been fortunate enough, after my dad passed, had been living with us. I had a new young child, son at the time, that sort of thing. And you want to shelter them from your own worry, right? So, my typical day was, we're going to get through this. Everybody's okay. Everything's going to be all right. And then when everybody went to sleep, I was left with my own, dark thoughts, to be honest. Where do we lead from here? Do we shutter the doors and do we move to another state and continue our business, our retail business, which, I had done. And really that sort of segues into what happened next. I had I guess a personal sort of awakening that, I didn't like what was going on. I didn't like the how the public, and I shouldn't say how the public, more the um, our advocates, be it the ACLU or the John Rolf Foundation, or any number of these folks, Civil Rights Corps, that sort of thing, was framing, what we were about, when they knew nothing about us or nothing about what exactly we've done. And so that upset me. And so, I think more from a therapeutic level, I started pushing back with my own grassroots. I mean, I had, I went to this company called Salsa Labs, which is ironically was originally funded and created by a George Soros Foundation for other advocates. And without making it complicated, essentially you could go on for, $300-500 a month and have this program that had where you could create, sort of grassroots campaigns to email lawmakers and that sort of thing. And so I just did it on my own, and I started doing it, and it blew up. This was after the constitutional amendment passed. Some of this rhetoric and what was going on and the pushback, New Jersey, and I'm sure you've seen the New Jersey page and that sort of thing, bled over into New York. And New York obviously is the mecca of media. And so it sort of took hold there, and it was really starting to move. And then several months later, so you figure January 1/17. Now, granted, sort of on a side note, I gained 35 pounds from eating Cheetos at night, worrying about what I was going to do next. I'm still trying to get that weight off, but the tail end of 2017 is these sort of campaigns that I had built were really starting to take hold. I was spending a significant amount of money, my own personal money. We probably blew six figures. So my family thought I was absolutely crazy. But I just didn't like the way our industry was being framed. I thought we as a whole, our profession was really behind the eight ball when it came to the public facing, the forward facing view of what we do, how we conduct ourselves. And so I was trying to change that. And at that point, Jeff Clayton, who was had been the executive director for the American Bail Coalition, gave me a ring, and he's like, "I don't know what you're doing, but I like it, and we've never seen anything like this before, and we've got some states where we need help in, just in terms of messaging." And really, that's what it was all about. It was really just about messaging and putting ourselves in a position to let constituents voice their opinions about what they thought about what was going to happen with, pretrial changes, bail reform, that sort of thing. And without getting into a bit of a more of a long-winded thing, it's, ABC was like, "Listen, we need some help on this. Why don't you come and, sort of partner with us for a couple of months?" I think 4 months was the target, because we had some states that, we were under crisis.
Oh, absolutely. No, I
mean, let's be honest. It was a crisis situation, and we were really behind. We won on all the arguments. We've always won on all the arguments, in my opinion, but we were behind the eight ball when it came to grassroots and that sort of thing. And so that's where I sort of plugged the hole. So I agreed to, join out with them for a couple of months, and then that turned into almost 10 years.
Before that, had you ever done any sort of face-to-face lobbying or advocacy or anything like that?
No, not really. I just, it was a passion project, right? It's, fear is a great motivator, right? So you force yourself to come out of your comfort zone. It's not something I ever necessarily envisioned for myself or wanted to do. But I love this profession. It's been, a blessing for me and my family. And so I felt like I needed to do something about it. And, it's a story I didn't know the ending to at the time. And ABC and some of the Surety partners took a chance on me in terms of, trying to create something that our profession or our industry just didn't have. And that was an advocacy arm that could could reach regular constituents, to educate them about what we do, to educate them about what these policies and bail reform and all these things mean. And so we, I'd like to think we knocked it out of the park for quite, several years, and a lot of that is attributed to the courage of the surety companies to step in when we needed them to, and to do what ABC was meant to do.
Well, I remember, no question. I remember, though, this is an old picture of you and Jeff standing, I think this was on Facebook, standing outside Kamala Harris's Senate office shortly after she and Rand Paul had teamed up on their bipartisan, anti-bail bill. And I'm sure that, meeting with these people and everything like is old hat by now, but was that a bit of a culture shock for you to go from, well, I'm doing this online advocacy, my business has been devastated, to couple years later, or even less than that, you're walking through the halls of Congress, meeting with senators and Congress people, trying to get things rolled back?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that I just rolled right in there and everything was great, but that's not the case. I mean, I think, I know bail, I knew my business. Much like we all do, and the folks that listen to your podcast do, I felt comfortable with that. The other, it was a bit of a culture shock, without a doubt. I mean, I never envisioned I'd be, sitting with some of the top attorney generals, talking bail. I think one of the things that shocked me in talking to state lawmakers and that sort of thing was the fact that they knew so little about what we do, about the process in general, just the framework of the bail industry. I'm sure you've experienced the same. So it was very easy for me to talk about it. And again, I owe a lot to the American Bail Coalition, particularly Jeff, is a great mind when on these issues, and taught me a lot. And I just sort of ran with it, and the things that came natural, I leaned on, and the things that just never tried to pretend anything that I wasn't, which was just a concerned bail agent from New Jersey that knows my profession and knows how this system works. And then the rest sort of came naturally. I mean, I went from, having to get up at 3 a.m. to go post bond, or having an agent call me, to vet something, to, going to state capitals and that sort of thing. And, it was an adventure, but it was worthwhile. And we continue to do that to this day. I mean, I'm still connected to ABC, obviously, through Universal and that sort of thing. So, but a culture shock is an understatement.
Well, no, I've seen, there's pictures of you at Mar-a-Lago and in Hawaii at the RAGA conferences, and chatting up attorney generals and future senators, but I assume that wasn't all just fun and games and jet setting around the country and stuff. Tell us more about what you actually. I know you give some notes here about obviously talk about working with state association. I think that's really important. But bill tracking and other issues. What are some of the other things that you were doing at ABC?
Primarily it was the advocacy function.
Right.
We really didn't have any broad mechanics to track all kinds of different bills. So we leaned on some of our partners. ABC has been a member of the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the largest sort of public-private organization that has lawmakers all over the country. Primarily that, and that was started way back before me with ABC. And, I was fortunate enough to involve myself with that and continue to do that. So we did, a lot of legislative tracking, built out from the ground up a grassroots platform so that we could quickly engage in different states with different types of messaging. And we're not reinventing the wheel. I mean, our adversaries, if you will, are doing the same exact thing. We're just trying to build our own version of it. And then sort of later, as a couple of years went by with being in ABC, I started integrating myself more, at the things that you're talking about. I mean, it's really relationship driven, just like it is with any business. I mean, we've seen a lot of folks that started out as candidates for office that, we our only purpose was to just educate them, and from our lens, what bail meant and why we thought it was so important. And then they've graduated through the years to, higher office and that sort of thing, the Eric Schmidts of the world, and, Senator Schmidt, and, Jeff Landry, and those types of folks. And Ashley Moody, all of them. I mean, there's been a number of them, and really, and that's been a rewarding part, I think, for me, is being able to debate the issue with them, but like you said, it was it was certainly eye opening. There were a number of times where I had gone on a trip and come back and go, I can't believe I just spent 30 minutes debating bail with the top law enforcement officer of Florida or whatever, and so,
and why doesn't the top law enforcement officer know more about that?
Right. Yeah, clearly. But relationship driven, really just top down approach, and have a grassroots and advocacy arm that was effective. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that we started so behind the eight ball. Our industry has been serving our communities, serving the courts for 200 years. But largely just sort of flying under the radar. We were just another arm. We were a friend to the friendless before it was ever popular, right? So when it was a tough on crime era and everybody wanted to lock everybody up for jaywalking, we were the ones, having folks, giving the ability for folks to exercise their right to bail and that sort of thing. And that's why we've been such staunch advocates against preventive detention and those sorts of things. So, before it was cool to do, pre-trial, we've been involved in that. I mean, even as far back as advocating for some of these low-level offenses that, even if you get convicted, have no jail time. Like, why do we need bail for those? So we were advocating for things that they've advocated for, just nobody was listening at the time. I just don't think we had a big enough megaphone, and so that's really what it rolled down to.
Let's talk a little bit about the state associations, because obviously that's the perspective that I'm coming from here as well. All politics is local.
Yep.
And the same can be said about bail. All bail is local. For the longest time in Kansas, we didn't really do anything. And then whenever an attack came up, everybody kind of coalesced. And you talk to people in Wichita and Kansas City and Topeka, and try to get everybody together and organize, and just 5-alarm fire and try and encounter the attack. And largely those were successful over time, but it's just, then we basically turned into an association, and we're proactive, and we try and make changes. We try and address issues. We try and deal with the issues before they even come up at this point in time. But I assume that there's a lot of states, at least were, and probably some still are, in the same situation. That's like, there's either not a large enough bail population there, or they don't get along. I mean, the big bail bondsmen in those states, they butt heads, and they won't agree to wait a second, we need to protect the whole industry. And how does that work from, your current role in Universal, but also to ABC, as far as strengthening and providing data and information to these state associations?
Yeah, so I won't go back to New Jersey too much, but we were fractured there, and
right.
it impacted us big time. I think that I'd like to think that now is there's much less of what you're talking about than, say, even 10 years ago. We're a lot more sophisticated. Their associations are a lot more organized. They're doing proactive things like media. They're doing proactive things like CE education. They're doing proactive things in the community, for that matter, helping out with, integrating themselves in drug programs and, all those types of things. But again, it's the same thing. I mean, one of the things that I think I've noticed is, over the years, and we're closing the gaps, is, the agents and sureties and some of the national organizations, for whatever reason, sometimes it felt like they all thought they were in a different business, right? They're all in different types of businesses, but they're not. We're all in the same business. If one group struggles, we all struggle. And so, finding that nexus between, between the sureties and the agents and that sort of thing has been a struggle. When it came to ABC, I mean, we, again, we're fortunate to be able to go to these associations, let them know what was going on the national level, sort of preach to the choir that, we've got to figure out a way to all get along, and sort of check our egos at the door. I think we've done a lot better job at that. I mean, I started the conversation by saying fear is a great motivator. And, I think a lot of these organizations, and I'm sure Kansas can relate to this, is, when you're under threat and, feeling a bit helpless about what's happening in the legislature, no one person can do it alone. We all have to chip in. We all have to lean on what our strengths are, be it, some of these folks, their strengths might just be writing a check, to support the agent association, and others, doing podcasts to educate things, or what have you. So we all have different roles, and, I've seen that gap close, but I still think we have some work to do.
Well, let's talk about some of the big seminal battles that have gone on over this whole bail reform era here. So I mean, about the same time as New Jersey fell, and I think falling or being sacked is a good analogy. We saw the beginning of all these lawsuits being filed around the country by these activists. They would go out and they'd pick some smallish town and sue them for operating a wealth-based detention program and claim that this was a civil rights violation. Now, one of the things that most people don't realize, and this was tactically genius on their part, is that even if the lawsuit is completely frivolous, if there's a civil rights claim against the government, and that includes small local governments, the government can't recover their attorney's fees for defending the lawsuit. And a federal
Right.
lawsuit is ridiculously expensive. So these groups would come in and file these lawsuits to essentially blackmail the city into entering into settlement agreements where they'd admit some sort of constitutional violation, and change their entire bail system to a cashless bail. And so if you're a city that has a budget of $1 million and you get sued and your outside counsel says, well, yeah, we can defend this for you, it's going to be $250,000. Well, that's 25% of your annual budget. What are you going to do?
Right.
And so, I mean, they would go basically pick on the weak kid is essentially what they were doing on these things. And they try and get these settlement agreements, and then they'd take the settlement agreement. So look, here's an order from the court that says this is unconstitutional, other jurisdiction. We're going to sue you if you don't change it without having to actually sue. Now, one of the first cases that there was some real pushback on was the Walker v. Calhoun. It was a case in Georgia. It's one of the first big cases where the city didn't just fold. And I know ABC was involved in that case, at least in the latter stages. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in Walker versus Calhoun, and then what were kind of the fallout from that?
Well, I mean, I think that strategically, Walker Calhoun is monumental. If I could pick, two or three, sort of huge issues that have happened over the last, decade or two, at least in my opinion, I think Walker Calhoun has got to be at the top. Essentially, and you described it, perfectly. If they're not getting movement on the legislature, take it to the courts, take it to the constitutional challenge, that sort of thing, and essentially try to fee it to death. I mean, we had, you mentioned towards later stages with the American Bail Coalition. I mean, we had Paul Clement, former U.S. solicitor for Bush. Mm-hmm. I mean, arguably the best constitutional lawyer for whatever, in my opinion, if that's worth anything. I mean, arguably, it's certainly in the last 2 decades arguing the case, but essentially, Maurice Walker was, in 2015, he was arrested in Calhoun, Georgia for allegedly stealing a bicycle and was held on a preset bail, right? A bond, in a bail schedule. And the case challenged Calhoun's use of a fixed bail schedule because it didn't adequately consider ability to pay. So in essence, it was challenging the ability to pay. Is there a right to an affordable bail? That was really the question. And ultimately, the city, agreed to make some changes, but I think the outcome can be misconstrued after, an incredible amount of litigation, 11th Circuit, that sort of thing. I mean, you're talking about not only federal litigation, but equal protection claims, due process claims.
Right.
Walker, from a larger perspective, really kind of set the tone or set the blueprint for a national movement and a national strategy that those that would want to put us out of business or eliminate cash bail used. And so, and you frame that. So, but what ultimately happened, really the argument was that two people accused of a crime or the same crime shouldn't receive different outcomes simply because one person can afford it and one can't, right? And then after that, the lawsuit was filed. You saw it in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, New Orleans, Harris County, although a bit different. And like you said, find a local jurisdiction, challenge the bail schedule, try to get federal court intervention, that sort of thing. But what was important for us was it showed how the adversaries were framing this for the next 6, 7, 8 years, and so the outcome was critical. But essentially, they ruled, look, it was really all about due process. So ultimately, they decided, the 11th Circuit decided there's nothing wrong with bail schedules. There's nothing wrong. There's no right to an affordable bail as long as there's due process. So, in Calhoun's case, you can't get locked up on a $500 bail and not be able to afford it and not get a hearing for a week. That's unconstitutional. Yeah. So that part is unconstitutional. But as long as you got a hearing within 48 hours, you were good. And there was no such thing as an affordable bail. And importantly, what a lot of people failed to remember is the court can still leave the bail amount where it was. So, that point often gets lost in the discussion with Calhoun. But that was a, tremendous effort and really one of the bigger challenges, the first real big challenge from a litigation standpoint.
Well, and if we're going in to make an argument to someone, Calhoun is, or Walker v. Calhoun, but Wells referred to as Calhoun, is a great argument to make, because basically the argument, the ultimate decision was, as long as the judge gets you in front within 48 hours to make an individualized determination about you, the defendant, not just the bail schedule works fine as an interim period of time up to 48 hours. Once the judge gets in there and can make that individualized determination, then everything is perfectly fine from a constitutional standpoint. You've got due process, and there's no right to affordable bail.
Right.
And then they appealed that to the Supreme Court. They filed certiorari to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, we agree with that. Yep. I mean, they didn't hear it and make the Supreme Court ruling, but the fact that they denied certiorari means that's black letter law that we can rely on.
Correct. And then sort of that was the trickle down for a lot of these other states. And, I, certainly remember when that ruling came out, I thought it was critical, because I can't stress enough just the fact that, that was sort of the blueprint for how this was going to pan out in much of these states. And it was going to have a downward sort of ripple effect on everybody. And, it was, certainly one for the history books, in terms of our profession.
Well, and then the other two big ones, probably O'Donnell versus Harris County, in Houston, and then Daves versus Dallas County. And O'Donnell, was back and forth, the Fifth Circuit. I mean, the Houston, Harris County was challenging it, and then the judges that were challenging it lost their election, and then a whole progressive slate come and say, no, we're fine with that. Which no judge would ever really do. Say, no, it's okay. We don't have that authority.
That one was hard to follow.
Yeah, because it was so back and forth all the time. But finally, the Daves v. Dallas County case, and I remember this because I'd quoted O'Donnell as saying something that Dave said, and then I had to go back and try and retrace my steps with the guy I was telling it to. But Daves basically finally said that the federal courts were not the appropriate forum for these attempts to change state bail laws. I mean, basically, the Dave's ruling on the Fifth Circuit was don't come back, more or less.
Right. Leave it to the states.
Right. So, I mean, with the Fifth Circuit telling EJOL or whatever their current name is now, are we done with these anti-bail lawsuits at the federal level, or are they still kicking in here and there, trying to find some different angle on it?
I mean, I'm sure that they're going to try to, they're going to continue the fight. I mean, I think they're going to continue to challenge bail schedules in part. I think that they're probably going to find other angles. I think from the 30,000-foot view, I think the larger threat is probably gone. But let's be honest. I mean, folks like the Civil Rights Corps and they're super well funded. They will litigate you to death. There's other types of regulatory challenges that they're getting into in California. Making different types of accusations against the industry that are frivolous, that we're going to probably continue to defend. But I think the larger, the court spoke, and so I think we can sort of close the book on at least most of that chapter, and see where we lead next.
Right. Well, I mean, unfortunately, death by 1,000 cuts is still death. So hopefully you can put a lot of that back.
Exactly.
So, and then probably second big battle that really came up was in California, and that's still going on. At the same time that these groups were attacking bail in New Jersey, they were at it in California. And this is a sidetrack issue, but this is one reason I will never, ever vote for Kamala Harris for any office, ever. Because in the Buffin versus San Francisco case, which was attacking the constitutionality of a California statute setting bail, Harris at the time was the California Attorney General.
Correct.
She refused to defend the state statute, even though that is the job of the AG to defend state statutes.
Correct.
Regardless of whether she agrees with them or not. I mean, you are the attorney for the state. Your job is to defend the statute. You do not have the AG's veto over some statute. Anyway, right. I get a little stressed about that one.
Well said. It was frustrating.
But at the same time, or about in the same vein of time, the California legislature passed and the governor signed Senate Bill 10, which would have effectively abolished bail in California. And so ABC was involved in that. Since bail has not been abolished in California, how did that go out? I mean, the governor signed the bill, you figure, hey, we're dead.
Yeah, Senate Bill 10, what a giant piece of legislation, hugely fought battle. It essentially eliminated bail entirely in favor of risk tools, some detention measures, but primarily risk tools. Senate Bill 10 passes. The very next day, our partners at American Bail Coalition talked to other partners. We're like, this is problematic on a number of levels, not just from a bail perspective, but it's just, this is not going to end well for the state of California. I mean, obviously we have our own interests that we're trying to protect, but it was a broader issue, right? I mean, there were lots of folks that were opposed to risk tools. A couple of years prior to that, I think we were probably one of the first to sound the alarm on risk tools as being, racially biased. And, if you put bad information in, you're going to get bad information out. And that's always been the idea. Even today, with New Jersey using risk tools, I mean, they claimed it was going to improve racial disparities in the jail. It hasn't. If anything, it's worsened it. The problem with New Jersey is Rule 138, which essentially lets the courts decide what they want to do with open records. So, unlike places like Colorado where they have a time frame and you can say, I want these kinds of open records, and they have to give it to you within 24 hours, New Jersey can just say, I think it's in the best interest that we not let this information be public. So that's why we can never get any information in New Jersey as to whether or not it's working or it's not working. We can only see the details that they get. But back to California, the American Bail Coalition, along with a lot of partners outside of the American Bail Coalition, sort of put together this framework on whether or not we wanted to challenge Senate Bill 10 and let the voters decide. And really, that was the idea. You can frame it however you want. Outside of our industry, we didn't think it was good for public safety. We didn't think it was good for the citizens. We certainly didn't think it was good for the thousands of agents who were supporting families and for the defendants, for that matter. And we were arguing, a couple of years prior, and this was ramping up about risk tools and how they were racially charged and they were disproportionate towards minorities and that sort of thing. And so we decided to fund, to begin to fund a referendum, which later turned out Prop 25. And we qualified for the referendum, worked with one of the larger groups, Russo Mavardi, to sort of organize this. And we were, I think, outspent probably 10-1. Don't quote me on that, but it was a lot. There were folks, from
just to interrupt you for just a second. Say outspent. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I recall, one of the biggest financial proponents of that was the Government Employees Union in California. I forget, it starts with an S or something like that. They were one of the huge supporters of that.
Well, they were supporters because they were creating an entire employee base of pretrial service workers that were all going to be paying dues.
Right. So, I mean, basically,
they would argue that that's not the case. I'm going to argue that that's exactly what the case was. It had nothing to do with public safety or anything. But yes, you're right. But
what would their interest as a public employees union then be if not expanding our base of potential, union members, because you're not sticking up for your current members.
Right. And they're powerful. The SEIU is, and so, between them, I mean, we had who was a Balmer, and I mean, this is all public knowledge, the Microsoft founder. I mean, he was dumping money into it. I mean, it was a Herculean effort just to get on the ballot. And this misconception from those outside of our industry that these insurance companies are just rolling around in cash is ridiculous. It's a small margin, high risk profile service to those. I mean, I never understood those that would argue against bail, and I'm sort of getting on my soapbox a little bit, but why would you want to be monitored pretrial from the very people that are prosecuting you? I would much rather have a third party that can exercise that right, so I can go out and defend myself or whatever the charges were. But in any case,
defense attorneys would want that as well.
Yeah.
I don't want my client being supervised by the local sheriff or someone else who can then question them and do all this other stuff that can be used against them at trial.
Right. I just want to be able to call, my bondsman and, take care of my situation on my own in private. And, I mean, that was the whole, Paul Clement, you mentioned Paul Clement. I mean, he argued another case, with challenging New Jersey, basically because the guy was like, look, I wanted bail. They didn't allow me to get bail. Instead, they put an ankle monitor on me. I lost my job because I'm walking around with a shackle, when I could have just quietly dealt with this and, in the courts, and it was over a bar fight. But that's a discussion for another podcast. But, we got Prop 25 on the ballot. It was I think a lot of folks considered it a long shot. We didn't, because we had faith in constituents and the voters in California that they could see through this, that they were giving up a core constitutional right in favor of a computer system to decide whether or not they were going to be free or not. At one point, the ACLU and some others flipped on this because of the fact that the risk tools were not the answer. So even if they didn't agree with the bail system or the structured bail system in California, they did agree that it was a worse system. And ultimately we won by a long shot, 57%, I believe. And so, again, monumental shift with our profession over the last decade between Walker, on the legislature, on the court side, the litigation side, state side, from a policy perspective. I mean, that was huge in California, and a lot of people participated in that. Certainly ABC did, and a lot of those folks outside of ABC. And I think ultimately for in the best interest of the citizens of California, despite other issues that have popped up. I mean, you mentioned a couple of other court cases. I mean, it's been a struggle there, and they've got some issues now they're dealing with.
Well, it does, we always think of California as this, far left, crazy, deep blue state, and it is to a certain extent. But if you get a 57% margin to keep the current system in a fairly progressive state, you'd think the legislature would go, hey, maybe this isn't the issue we should be pursuing. Not that they're doing that, but you would think that they would do that. So, I mean, the question is, who are they actually responding to, voters or not? It just, so then you go to the voters. Going to the voters, though, is most of the time, especially like when you have constitutional amendments where they're saying, well, we're going to lock up the bad people. That's a really tough argument to try and overcome.
Right.
And I mean, we saw that in New Mexico. I mean, I'm sure that same argument was made in New Jersey. They're making the same arguments in Indiana and Tennessee right now. And it's like,
Correct.
that's a tough one to overcome, even though that's not necessarily the ultimate goal. So let's
Yeah, and I think the difficulty with that too is, it's the defining moment of that. Like, what does that actually mean? The
Right.
preventive detention in Tennessee is so much different than the one in Indiana. That's much more broad.
Right.
But we won't go down that rabbit hole. But I mean, it's much more than just let's lock up the bad guys. I mean, this preventive detention was really a reaction to everybody going away from capital offenses, or the death penalty and that sort of thing. And so, but you give them a little inch, and all of a sudden every year it's what's the new crime of the day, that we have to lock up, and that's a dangerous precedent to set.
So let's go back to New Jersey. I know we every anti-bail argument that I hear references both Illinois and New Jersey. The world can see how that's worked out in Chicago. People being lit on fire on train stations and crime out of control. But tell us, New Jersey is at least a little more circumspect about it. So tell us about New Jersey. I guess what the first kind of jokey question is how much did the Arnold Ventures or whatever their proxies are contribute to the Chris Christie campaign for either governor or president?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm fairly certain it was deep pockets, and there was some chicanery there, but it's I think the transparency is probably the biggest issue in New Jersey. I mean, what's proven from the courts issue statement every year about how they're doing, and they issue a long-winded report about pretrial. We've gone from a state that that had your right to bail, your ability to post bond, to somewhere that, I mean, we've got 21 counties, there's 94 million people or so here, and we're locking up 9,000 people preventively detained, and don't have the transparency to find out what's happened with the cases. Is the speedy trial kicking in? That type of thing. And I think that's and on top of that, crime is still an issue. These certain areas in New Jersey are still hotbeds of crime. It hasn't improved anything, at least in my view.
Didn't they have to create their own auto theft task force here out of the Attorney General's office because auto theft was so out of control?
Yeah, 100%, and that continues to be an issue. The other thing I don't think that a lot of people understand is when the municipal courts, and there are many here, are still setting these little bonds, still locking people up over $750 bonds and all this other kind of stuff. It really didn't change any of that. The whole premise behind New Jersey was based on one report that there were 1,500 people that couldn't afford their bail that were just locked up, and but that was all not true. They didn't vet all these folks that were in there.
Right.
As well as I know that there are many factors as to reason why somebody's in jail, and rarely is it because of money. It has to do with the fact that the family wants them in there for safety reasons. Maybe they burn their bridges with their third party indemnitors. Maybe they have other cases. Maybe they were on parole. They didn't do any of that, and so it was a knee-jerk reaction. It was a Chris Christie project that that he thought could catapult him to the next level. And unfortunately, I think certainly in some of the higher populated and impoverished areas in New Jersey, they're the ones paying the price because these people are being put in, let out, put in, let out, put in, let out. And it's just one big revolving door. And I hate to use the word revolving door, but it really is, and it did nothing to fix the racial disparity. So, is there going to be change on that level? I doubt it. Not until, the makeup of the legislature changes.
Right.
I thought we were close to last governor's election, but I don't think that, unfortunately that didn't work out.
couple of things I want to touch on there real quick. One is probably less serious, but is the Chris Christie. The program works so well that when he did run for president in 2016, he didn't mention it at all. So
Right.
it's like my whole this isn't going to be a catapult. It's like, oh, this isn't working too well.
Anytime there was ever pushback, he'd get one little article in like NJ.com, that he'd write, and then it was just like kind of under the rug, and that's because the writing's on the wall. Nobody wants to admit it was a massive failure, and honestly, it was from a budgeting perspective. I mean, it was a mandate to counties. They fought that. They filed a lawsuit for it being an unfunded mandate, and they didn't lose on the merits. They lost on a technicality because it was a constitutional amendment. But
and that was the other thing I was going to was the cost. I mean, I've heard numbers here that it's over $250 million a year that the state of New Jersey.
Oh yeah. Yeah, easily, and that remains it. And it seems like, and admittingly, I haven't tracked it as close as I have prior years, last couple of years. But every time I, read the report, they need more money, and it's just a revolving. They had hundreds of millions of dollars when they finally implemented this from 2014 to that initiation, initial run in 2017, and they burned that up in literally months.
Right.
And so they're adding FTEs. It's been a constant struggle, so it's a money pit for sure.
Well, so if we do the math on that, and this is an argument that I've been kind of tossing around back and forth, is basically New Jersey spends $250 million a year on their pretrial program. The city of Washington, D.C., which has a similar type program, spends over $70 million a year. So that's $320 million, a third of $1 billion that they're spending each year in just one state and one city. Now, one of the arguments that I always hear about us is where they try and paint the bail bond industry as like this, Scrooge McDuck characters or whatever, that this is a $2 billion a year industry nationwide. And I'm thinking, man, that's a pretty good deal. If you've got one state and one city spending $320 million a year in taxpayer money, $2 billion paid by somebody else nationwide, I don't think that's a good deal. So, I mean, haven't been able to coalesce that into a good cohesive argument, but it seems like a pretty good bargain for the taxpayers if that's all that the bail bond industry is generating.
Yeah, it's been pretrial services in general, I think in large part have been a boondoggle. It went away from trying to really help low income people that are struggling, those that need jobs, those that need, clothes to go get a job, those that are acting out based on, underlying issues where they could get outside services. And, really that's where the value, I think, there is in those types of programs to just monitoring. Now we're shackling everybody. We're doing all kinds of e-carceration. Everybody's got an ankle monitor. Everybody's got to do this. And I think we're overcomplicating this to, and not to our benefit, and costing, taxpayers hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars.
Okay, let's get back to you just because I know we're getting close up against time here. You are now currently the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Distribution at Universal Surety. I'm not sure how that all fits on a business card, but what is the VP of Advocacy?
Certainly wasn't my choice. Certainly wasn't my choice. No, it's been fun. We talked a little bit about my path. I grew up around this business, been passionate about it. Nothing but, wonderful memories. Young, went a decade in New Jersey, almost a decade doing advocacy. I would argue probably what makes, me a little unique is that I've seen it through, 3 different lenses now. I've seen it through retail operation. I've seen it through, sort of the grassroots and lobbying perspective and defending, and contributing my little bit to defending the right to bail for, probably the most pivotal decade that we've had, at least in my memory. Right. So now, there was a transition period. Universal Fire and Casualty, they've been members of ABC for a couple of decades now, and the rest of the members there. I love every one of them. They were tremendous to me. I think towards the end of last year, I felt I'm starting to age a little bit. I feel like there's maybe one more stop left in. And to be quite frank with you, you talked about, being in Mar-a-Lago and doing this and, and it was all great. And I think it was for a good purpose and I enjoy it. And, there's some aspects of that I can still participate in, but I really truly did miss bail offices and bail agents and just the smell of an office and walking to the jail and talking to the folks and sharing stories, success stories about how, we bonded somebody out and got them back on their feet. Success stories about how, mom is coming, she's completely distraught, doesn't know what's going on. And we walk them through the process, and those things, having grown up around it and experienced it myself in my own retail operation, I honestly did. I have a connection to that. I'm passionate about it. I wanted to figure out how to get, back into that without, I still live in New Jersey. So obviously that retail section, that option's out. My son's graduating high school next year and moving to college, and I didn't want to relocate us. And it just seemed like a natural progression to me. I had a lot of friends in the surety business, not just at Universal, and many different sureties. And Universal was, certainly willing to open their arms and say, maybe this is your next stop, and you can talk to some agents and do that thing and do that type of thing. One of the things that I do appreciate, I think, in this role is part of my role with them is to be the liaison with the American Bail Coalition. So a lot of what I did for ABC, the grassroots, a lot of communication, sort of the bill tracking, I can still do that as a sort of an in-kind contribution. So a lot of my, the role I had at ABC still remains intact, even if it's on a little bit more limited basis. I've obviously got a New Jersey to wear, so to speak, with a different number on it. But I still have the ABC patch on my jersey. It's just a different jersey now, so I love all my friends there. I appreciate Universal for allowing me that opportunity to continue doing the good work I think that we need to do at ABC, but, allow me to get into, sort of another industry or another aspect of our profession. So it's been rewarding so far. It's only December, so, who knows?
Well, let's look here at future. I mean, like I said, you have a perspective that I think is maybe limited to maybe 4 or 5 people in the whole country, maybe just one, maybe just you. I don't know that many other people have traveled this same path that you have to where you have, but what does the future look like? I mean, you've raised concern about the average age of bondsmen or at least owners. Now I was 20 when I started doing this, but I'm not 20 anymore. But I know that I'm the exception. Not a whole lot of young people, moving into this. How do we find those future leaders? Especially at the local level, when those people are often direct competitors, and it's like, boy, I know what I've been doing this for 50 years. So I don't want to listen to what you have to say. And it's like, so how do we build that up?
It's a good question. I think, a lot of us would agree that we're an aging industry, particularly, 6, 7 years ago. I don't, if you'd have asked most bondsmen, agency owners, are you bringing your family into this? They probably tell you no. We were under a tremendous amount of stress. And you always want a little bit better for your kids. Not to say that this isn't better. I mean, I wanted to do this. I was, my parents were smart enough to say, look, you need to go and sow your oats a little bit and get an education. Come back, we'll welcome you with open arms, but, this is what you need to do. I mean, I think a couple of things, I guess, come to my mind is one, I think our industry and our profession has progressed a little bit. I think that I see more professionalism now than I used to certainly when I was growing up. So I think, our future really belongs to those professional operators that are coming up through the ranks. I do see more youth now, particularly now that in my new role that I can go out and I can talk to more people, and I'm paying attention a little bit differently than I did, say, a year ago. So I am seeing that. I think that technology is playing a big role in what shapes our future. There's big debates now on e-bonds and electronic bonds and those types of things. And so I think that I don't think that it's going to replace. In fact, I know it's not going to replace bail agents, but I do think that it's going to make us more efficient I think in the long run, whatever iteration we end up agreeing on, or states end up agreeing on with respect to e-bonds and that sort of things. And I guess, probably my last point would be, or maybe second to last, I guess, really when I think about it, is I think there's been some consolidation. And I think mainly because our laws have changed in certain states, these smaller bonds aren't as relevant as they were, say, in the 80s and 90s. So there's been some consolidation with some smaller agencies, even if it's multi-generational stuff. So, there's larger agencies, I think, retail shops, more sophisticated operators out there, and they are having to adapt, I think, to more compliance standards. We're seeing lots of legislation on regulatory stuff, which I think is going to, even, think about even like states changing to where you need a PNC license now. I can't remember what it is in Kansas. I don't think you need a PNC license there, but
It depends.
so they're raising the bar, right, from a regulatory perspective. But I don't think the biggest challenge is, in my view, in the next 10 years is legislation. I know that sounds crazy because we're dealing with some hot buttons, in California and a couple of other states. In my view, I think just ahead of that challenge, it's always been a challenge legislatively, but I think just ahead of that challenge, the biggest challenge is who is going to carry the industry forward. And I'm not sure that I see that yet. I see some light at the end of the tunnel. Some of the national organizations are getting bigger. They're more prominent. They're better funded. There's more participation. I am seeing a little bit younger, a little bit younger crowd showing up at these national meetings and those types of things, which is encouraging to me. But now that I've been able to see from that third lens, you start looking at your whole client base. They're multi-generational families there, but I'm seeing fewer of of the youth, even though I've started to see sort of signs of light, I guess. So I think that's the biggest challenge: is who's gonna be the next generation to carry it forward. And I hope to be a part of shaping how that happens. All of us, I think, need to participate in, the time that you take out to do these podcasts, the time, your friend Dave Stuffman and some of the other surety companies that are investing in our state associations and our national associations, that type of thing. I hope that we don't get complacent as things start to calm down a little bit. You spoke, at the beginning of the hour about that, that, we just sort of sit on our hands for a little bit and then we're reactive instead of being proactive. Now Kansas is proactive, but for a long time they were reactive. And I think there's still large pockets of the U.S., the 46 states that do, certainly do commercial bail, that are still being reactive and not proactive. I can think, some really great examples. I know, Rene Anzadola in Texas, in his one little county, that he has one little county bail association. They are so involved in their community. And this is a very democratic, quite honestly, a more liberal county that he operates in, but he is so invested in his community, being it, going to every fundraiser, hosting things, toy drives, all kinds of different things for his county, and everybody knows him. And that's how you integrate, and that's how you demonstrate the value of working and operating in your community and making sure that folks go to court and doing the things that are difficult, that are hard things that we have to do every day, that a lot of people don't realize that we do. So I think we've got to continue expanding on that.
Well, hopefully we can get that done, going forward. I know, the population's aging, lots of businesses are in the same position. So we got to try and, I know my son, is working at a big oil company, and he's of that age where they're dropping people off. And so he's managed to get some promotions probably above his age. I mean, he's good. He knows what he's doing, and he does a really good job for them, but they've identified him as okay, you're a person we want to focus on. And so it's like you sit there and go, okay, how do we do that here? I mean, I'm thinking about that in Kansas here. I'm not going to be here doing this forever. And so who's going to take over and go up and make these arguments to the legislature and coordinate all the stuff that I do? How do we find that person that there or people, a group that's willing to do that? And it's like,
right. I mean, how many times have you testified? It's been a number of times, and that's somebody always sort of, takes up
somebody,
rise to the occasion.
I mean, like you. So, we just need to find the next Chris Blaylock in each of these states.
We need to find the next Shane. We need to find the next a lot of us.
Exactly.
But I appreciate that.
Well, Chris, I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk today. This is awesome. There's probably 16 other things we could talk about as well. So hopefully we got a good show out of it. So, but thank you very much for taking the time.
I appreciate it, Shane. You're doing a great job. It's been a few moons since I've been on camera, so hopefully we had a vibrant discussion and we didn't go down the rabbit hole too bad. But I love talking to Bail. Love what you guys are doing. Keep up the great work. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. We would like to thank our guest, Chris Blaylock, for taking the time to talk to us today. I don't know that anyone else in the country has the same range of bail experiences that he brings to the table. And we as a profession are incredibly lucky to have him on the front lines. Talking to politicians and share his experience with us, it's really easy for local bail agents to not look at the state of bail past their own city or county. After all, they're just one small business. Fortunately, people like Chris are out there trying to watch the national picture for all of us. But please just join us on the next episode of the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we'll continue to bring you critical information and conversations with people involved in the criminal justice system.
Join us again next time for the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf and executive produced by David Stuckman.